The rain hammered against the windshield of Marcus Chen's beat-up Honda Civic as he sat in the circular driveway of one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods. At 6:47 a.m., the mansion before him looked like something from a magazine, all glass and steel jutting out from perfectly manicured lawns. He checked his phone again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His passenger was now 12 minutes late for what the app had marked as a school drop-off ride. Most drivers would have canceled by now, moved on to the next fare, but Marcus had learned patience the hard way. The front door finally opened, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 14 stumbled out, her designer backpack sliding off one shoulder as she clutched a half-eaten piece of toast. Even from 30 feet away, Marcus could see the exhaustion etched across her face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually pristine private school uniform was wrinkled, as if she'd slept in it. This was Emma Rodriguez, though Marcus didn't know her name yet. All he knew was that someone had ordered an Uber to Westfield Preparatory Academy, and he was the driver assigned to get her there. Emma slumped into the back seat without a word, immediately pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed something that made his stomach tighten with recognition. The girl was trying to hold back tears, her breathing shallow and quick. As a single father to 9-year-old Sophie, he'd seen this look before. This wasn't just teenage moodiness or Monday morning blues. This was a kid drowning. "Rough morning?" Marcus asked gently, pulling away from the mansion as Emma frantically typed on her phone. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten there was another person in the car. Most Uber drivers didn't talk to her. Most adults didn't, actually, unless they were giving her instructions or asking about her grades. "I have a calculus test first period," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I studied until 3 a.m., but I still don't understand half of it. And if I fail this one—" She trailed off, returning to her phone where Marcus could see she was frantically reviewing notes and formulas. Marcus had driven hundreds of students to Westfield Prep over the past year. He'd learned to recognize the signs of the pressure cooker that elite education had become. But something about Emma was different. The way she held herself so carefully, like she might shatter if she moved too quickly. The way she apologized when her phone rang, even though she didn't answer it. The way she seemed to shrink into herself when the imposing brick facade of Westfield Prep came into view. What Marcus didn't know as he watched Emma disappear into the crowd of perfectly groomed students was that he'd just met the daughter of Rebecca Rodriguez, CEO of Technova Industries, one of Denver's fastest-growing software companies. Rebecca had built her empire from nothing, clawing her way up from a working-class family in East Denver to the corner office of a downtown skyscraper. She was brilliant, driven, and absolutely terrified that she was failing at the one job that mattered most. Emma's schedule read like a military operation. Advanced placement classes in every subject, violin lessons with the Colorado Symphony's first chair, Mandarin tutoring 3 times a week, SAT prep on weekends, and volunteer work at the hospital that looked good on college applications but left her feeling empty. At 14, she was taking courses that challenged college sophomores, maintaining a 4.2 GPA that never felt quite good enough, and carrying the weight of expectations that grew heavier with each academic achievement. The panic attacks had started 6 months ago, creeping up during chemistry labs when the formulas wouldn't stick in her exhausted mind, or in the middle of violin recitals when her fingers forgot their training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Emma had become an expert at hiding them, stepping into bathroom stalls to catch her breath, making excuses to leave class when the walls felt like they were closing in. She'd mentioned feeling stressed to her mother once, during a rare dinner they shared at home, but Rebecca's solution had been swift and decisive. More tutoring, a better planner, and a consultation with Dr. Williams, a psychiatrist who specialized in high-achieving adolescents. Dr. Williams had prescribed medication and breathing exercises, both of which Emma dutifully tried, but neither addressed the core problem. Emma wasn't struggling because she couldn't handle the work. She was struggling because she'd forgotten who she was beneath all the achievements. Every conversation with her mother centered around grades, test scores, and college prospects. Every social interaction at school felt like a competition she was simultaneously winning and losing. She'd become so focused on being perfect that she'd lost sight of being human. Marcus, meanwhile, was fighting his own battles on the other side of Denver. His small apartment in the Highlands neighborhood was a world away from Emma's mansion, but the struggles of single parenthood were universal. After his wife Lisa had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, Marcus had quit his job as a high school math teacher to have more flexible hours with Sophie. Uber driving paid the bills, barely, and allowed him to pick Sophie up from school, help with homework, and be present in a way that Lisa would have wanted. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days driving other people's children to opportunities he could barely afford for his own daughter. Sophie attended public school in a district that was understaffed and underfunded, but she was thriving in ways that surprised him daily. She had friends from every background imaginable, teachers who knew her personally, and the freedom to explore interests without the crushing weight of expectation that seemed to suffocate so many of the private school students he transported. As Marcus navigated the morning traffic back toward downtown Denver, he couldn't shake the image of Emma's face in his rearview mirror. Something about her reminded him of the students he used to teach, the ones who were so focused on grades that they'd forgotten learning could be joyful. He'd seen that look before, the exhaustion that came not from working hard, but from working without purpose, from achieving without understanding why the achievement mattered. That afternoon, Marcus was surprised to get another ride request to the same address in Cherry Hills. It was Emma again, this time slumped against the doorframe of her mansion, still in her school uniform but looking somehow smaller than she had that morning. When she got in the car, Marcus noticed she'd been crying. "How did the calculus test go?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than just making conversation. Emma looked up, surprised that he remembered. Most adults asked about her day as a formality, already moving on to the next topic before she could answer. "I think I failed it," she said simply. "Which means my GPA drops, which means my class rank drops, which means—" She shrugged, as if the rest was inevitable and too exhausting to explain. Marcus had taught enough students to recognize the spiral of catastrophic thinking that high achievers fell into when perfection became impossible. One bad grade became failure. Failure became unworthiness. Unworthiness became proof that all the sacrifice had been meaningless. It was a brutal cycle that he'd seen destroy brilliant kids who couldn't see past their next assignment to remember why they'd started learning in the first place. Rebecca Rodriguez had never intended to become the kind of mother she'd sworn she'd never be. Growing up in a cramped apartment above her grandmother's restaurant in East Denver, she'd watched her parents work 18-hour days just to keep the lights on. Her father, Miguel, had calloused hands from washing dishes and installing drywall on weekends. Her mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings at night and served tables during lunch rushes. They were good people who loved their daughter fiercely, but love couldn't pay for college or create opportunities that didn't exist in their neighborhood. Rebecca learned early that education was her only ticket out. While other kids played after school, she studied in the restaurant's back booth, doing homework by the light of the kitchen prep area. She taught herself advanced math from library books and convinced her high school counselor to let her take community college courses during her senior year. Every scholarship application, every honor roll certificate, every academic achievement was a step away from the life of financial uncertainty that had defined her childhood. The transformation hadn't been easy. At the University of Colorado, Rebecca felt the weight of being different from her classmates who spoke casually about spring break trips to Europe and summer internships their parents had arranged. She worked in the dining hall, tutored struggling students for extra money, and spent holidays on campus because she couldn't afford to fly home. But she graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science and a burning determination to never feel powerless again. Technova Industries had started in Rebecca's studio apartment 7 years ago, built on the revolutionary idea of making enterprise software accessible to small businesses. She'd identified a gap in the market where companies like her grandmother's restaurant were forced to choose between expensive systems they couldn't afford and outdated methods that limited their growth. Her software bridged that gap, and within 3 years, Technova was valued at $50 million. Success brought Rebecca everything she'd dreamed of during those late nights studying in the restaurant. The mansion in Cherry Hills, the respect of industry peers, and the financial security to ensure Emma would never experience the uncertainty that had shaped Rebecca's own childhood. But somewhere in the pursuit of providing everything she'd lacked, Rebecca had recreated a different kind of deprivation. Emma had every material advantage but was starving for the one thing money couldn't buy: her mother's undivided attention. The irony was crushing when Rebecca allowed herself to acknowledge it. She'd built Technova partly to have the flexibility to be present for Emma, to be the engaged parent she'd never had. Instead, the company's growth demanded constant travel, investor meetings, and strategic decisions that couldn't wait for bedtime stories or soccer games. Rebecca told herself it was temporary, that once the company stabilized, she'd have more time. But in the tech industry, stability was an illusion. There was always the next product launch, the next market expansion, the next crisis that required her immediate attention. Emma's childhood had become a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maximize her potential. Rebecca hired the best tutors, enrolled her in programs at prestigious institutions, and surrounded her with opportunities that most kids could only dream of. Every decision was made with Emma's future in mind, from the violin lessons that would demonstrate well-roundedness on college applications to the volunteer work that showed commitment to community service. Rebecca was determined that Emma would have choices, that no door would be closed to her because of inadequate preparation. But preparation had become prison. Emma's days were scheduled in 15-minute increments, optimized for maximum learning and achievement. She spoke 3 languages, played violin at a near-professional level, and was taking calculus 2 years ahead of her peers. On paper, she was extraordinary. In reality, she was exhausted, anxious, and increasingly disconnected from any sense of authentic self. The panic attacks had started during a violin competition 6 months earlier. Emma had practiced for weeks, her technique flawless, her memorization perfect. But as she walked onto the stage, her chest had tightened, her vision blurred, and she'd felt like she was drowning in front of 200 people. She'd managed to play through it, even won second place, but the experience left her shaken. The attacks began happening more frequently, triggered by academic pressure, social situations, and sometimes by nothing she could identify. Rebecca had noticed the changes in Emma, but interpreted them through the lens of her own experience. When Emma seemed stressed, Rebecca's instinct was to provide more resources, better support systems, additional help. Dr. Williams had been highly recommended, a specialist who worked with gifted children from high-achieving families. The medication he prescribed helped with the physical symptoms of anxiety, but it didn't address the underlying issue that Emma felt like she was living someone else's life. Marcus Chen's story had taken a different trajectory entirely. Growing up in Seattle as the son of Taiwanese immigrants, he'd been raised with similar academic expectations. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities in America, working in a laundromat while putting themselves through night school to learn English. Mathematics had been Marcus's gift, numbers and equations making sense in a way that sometimes felt more natural than spoken language. Unlike Rebecca, Marcus had found joy in learning that went beyond achievement. His high school math teacher, Mr. Peterson, had shown him that mathematics wasn't just about getting the right answer, but about understanding the elegant patterns that governed everything from music to architecture to nature itself. Marcus had fallen in love with teaching during college, discovering that helping others understand complex concepts gave him more satisfaction than solving problems alone. For 8 years, Marcus had taught algebra and calculus at Jefferson High School in Aurora. He'd worked with students from every background, many of whom came to his classroom convinced they were bad at math. His gift was helping them see that mathematical thinking was already part of their daily lives, that they'd been solving equations every time they figured out how much time they needed to get to work, or calculated whether they could afford groceries and rent in the same week. Lisa had been a social worker at the middle school that fed into Jefferson High. They'd met at a conference about supporting at-risk students and had bonded over their shared belief that every kid deserved someone who believed in their potential. Their marriage had been a partnership built on mutual respect and complementary strengths. Lisa understood the emotional complexities that Marcus sometimes missed, while Marcus could break down overwhelming problems into manageable steps that Lisa found reassuring. Sophie had been their miracle baby, born after 3 miscarriages that had tested their faith and their marriage. She was curious, empathetic, and possessed an intuitive understanding of people that reminded Marcus daily of Lisa. When Sophie struggled with reading in first grade, Marcus had expected to feel the familiar parental anxiety about academic performance. Instead, he'd found himself marveling at her creative solutions and her ability to understand stories, even when the words were challenging. The car accident had shattered more than Marcus's heart. It had destroyed his financial stability, his career trajectory, and his confidence in his ability to protect the people he loved. Lisa had been driving home from a late meeting when a drunk driver ran a red light. The settlement from the other driver's insurance had covered Lisa's medical bills and funeral costs, but it hadn't replaced her income or filled the emotional void her death had created. Marcus had tried to continue teaching after Lisa's death, but grief made it impossible to maintain the energy and enthusiasm that effective teaching required. Sophie needed him in ways that his students couldn't, and the inflexible schedule of the school day didn't accommodate the unpredictable demands of single parenthood. When Sophie had nightmares, when she got sick at school, when she needed help, processing emotions too big for a 7-year-old to handle alone, Marcus needed to be available. Uber driving had seemed like a practical solution to an impossible situation. The flexible schedule allowed Marcus to be present for Sophie while still earning income. He could drive during school hours, pick Sophie up every afternoon, and be home for dinner and bedtime routines. The pay was unpredictable and far less than his teaching salary had been, but it provided what his family needed most: time together and emotional stability. What Marcus hadn't expected was how much he would learn about his community through driving. Every passenger had a story, and many of them were struggling with challenges that weren't visible from the outside. He'd driven executives to job interviews after layoffs, college students to medical appointments they couldn't afford, and elderly people to visit spouses in nursing homes. The work had given him a perspective on human resilience that his classroom experience hadn't provided. The students he drove to private schools often reminded him of his former students, but with crucial differences. His Jefferson High kids had faced external obstacles like poverty, language barriers, and family instability. Many of the private school students he now transported were facing internal obstacles, pressure, and expectations that were crushing them from within. Both groups of kids were struggling, but the private school students had fewer people who recognized their pain because their problems looked like privileges from the outside. When Marcus first met Emma, something about her reminded him of Sarah Kim, a student he'd taught 5 years earlier. Sarah had been brilliant, taking calculus as a sophomore and consistently scoring the highest grades in class. But she'd been so paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes that she'd spend hours on homework assignments that should have taken 20 minutes. Marcus had eventually learned that Sarah's parents had tied her self-worth so tightly to academic performance that anything less than perfection felt like failure. The difference was that Sarah had other teachers who knew her, friends who saw her outside of academic contexts, and a school counselor who understood the pressure she was under. Emma seemed isolated in a way that worried Marcus. In their brief interactions, she'd mentioned tutors and lessons and test prep, but never friends or activities she enjoyed. She spoke about her schedule with the weary resignation of someone much older, as if childhood was an obstacle to overcome rather than a time to explore and discover. Marcus began to understand that Emma's struggles weren't so different from the challenges his former students had faced. The external circumstances were drastically different, but the core issue was the same. Emma needed someone who saw her as more than her achievements, who valued her thoughts and feelings independent of her performance. She needed what every teenager needed: an adult who believed in her worth regardless of her grades, and space to figure out who she was beyond everyone else's expectations. The more Marcus learned about Emma during their rides together, the more he realized that her mother's success had created its own kind of poverty. Emma was rich in opportunities, but poor in genuine connection. She had access to the best education money could buy, but was starving for the kind of learning that happened when someone cared enough to really listen to her questions and help her find her own answers. The routine began innocently enough. Emma's regular driver had requested Marcus specifically after their first few rides, something the app allowed for frequent passengers. What started as simple transportation gradually evolved into something neither of them had expected. Marcus found himself arriving a few minutes early each morning, giving Emma time to settle into the car and decompress from whatever crisis had dominated her morning routine. The conversation started small. Marcus would ask about her day, and unlike most adults in Emma's life, He actually listened to her answers. When she mentioned struggling with a calculus concept, he didn't immediately suggest more tutoring or additional practice time. Instead, he asked questions that helped her think through the problem differently. When she complained about feeling overwhelmed, he didn't dismiss her concerns or remind her how fortunate she was. He simply acknowledged that feeling overwhelmed was exhausting, regardless of the circumstances that caused it. 3 weeks into their morning routine, Emma mentioned that she had a chemistry test she was dreading. The periodic table made no sense to her, she said, just a random collection of symbols and numbers she was supposed to memorize. Marcus had taught enough students to recognize the difference between not understanding material and not understanding why the material mattered. During their 15-minute drive to school, he began explaining how the periodic table was actually a map, showing the relationships between elements and predicting how they would behave. "Think of it like a neighborhood," Marcus said, navigating through the morning traffic. "Elements that live close to each other have similar personalities. The noble gases in the far right column are like the quiet neighbors who keep to themselves and don't bother anyone. The alkali metals in the first column are like the friendly neighbors who want to bond with everyone they meet, sometimes a little too enthusiastically." Emma looked up from her phone for the first time during a ride, genuinely intrigued. "So the table isn't just random?" "Not even close," Marcus replied. Dmitri Mendeleev figured out the pattern in 1869, and it was so reliable that he used it to predict elements that hadn't been discovered yet. Imagine knowing your neighborhood so well that you could predict what kind of person would move into an empty house before you even met them. For the first time in months, Emma felt excited about a chemistry test. Not because she was confident she'd get an A, but because the material suddenly made sense in a way that connected to something larger than memorization. That afternoon, when Marcus picked her up from school, Emma was practically bouncing in the back seat. "I actually understood the test," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Not just the answers, but why the answers made sense. Mrs. Peterson asked me to stay after class because she was so surprised by my explanation of electron shells. She said I showed real comprehension instead of just regurgitation." Marcus smiled, remembering the joy he'd felt when his own students had those breakthrough moments. How does it feel to understand something instead of just knowing it? Emma paused, considering the question seriously. Like I'm actually smart, instead of just good at memorizing things. Like I could figure out stuff I've never seen before. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Emma began asking Marcus questions about other subjects, not because she needed help with homework, but because she was genuinely curious about how different concepts connected to each other. Marcus found himself looking forward to their rides with an anticipation he hadn't felt since his teaching days. Emma's questions reminded him why he'd fallen in love with education in the first place. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult week in October. Emma had 3 major tests, a violin recital, and a college prep seminar, all scheduled within 4 days. She got into Marcus's car on Monday morning, looking like she hadn't slept, her hands shaking as she tried to review flashcards for her AP European History exam. "I can't remember any of this," she said, her voice tight with panic. "I studied for 6 hours yesterday, but it's all just random facts floating around in my head. The French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, World War I, they're all mixing together." Marcus could hear the edge of hysteria in her voice, the same tone he'd heard from students who were on the verge of breaking down. Instead of offering platitudes about studying harder or getting more sleep, he tried a different approach. "Tell me about the French Revolution," he said calmly. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, looking up from her flashcards with confusion. "Just tell me the story. Pretend I don't know anything about it, and you're explaining it to me." Emma took a shaky breath and began reciting facts from her notes. The French Revolution began in 1789 when King Louis XVI called the Estates General because France was facing a financial crisis. The Third Estate formed the National Assembly and took the tennis court oath, pledging to create a new constitution. "Okay," Marcus said, "but why did that happen? What was really going on?" Emma paused, forced to think beyond memorization. The country was basically broke because they'd spent so much money on wars, including helping America fight Britain, but the king couldn't raise taxes on the nobles or the church, so all the burden fell on regular people who were already struggling. So what would you have done if you were a regular French person in 1789? The question surprised Emma. Her history classes focused on dates and names and political structures, but rarely asked students to consider the human experience behind historical events. "I guess I would have been angry," she said slowly. "Working hard, paying taxes, watching my children go hungry while rich people lived in palaces and paid nothing. And if you were angry enough, and you had thousands of other angry people around you, what might happen?" "Revolution," Emma said, and for the first time, the word felt like something real instead of just a vocabulary term. They weren't just overthrowing a government. They were trying to create a world where their children might have better lives. By the time they reached Westfield Prep, Emma had connected the French Revolution to the Industrial Revolution through the lens of social change, and both to World War I through the concept of how economic instability creates political upheaval. She hadn't memorized any new facts, but she understood the patterns that connected historical events across centuries. "You're going to do great on that test," Marcus said as Emma gathered her backpack. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because you understand the story now, not just the facts. And once you understand the story, the details make sense." Emma's history teacher, Dr. Martinez, had taught at Westfield Prep for 12 years. She'd seen thousands of students come through her classroom, most of them well-prepared and academically capable. But Emma's performance on the European history exam was remarkable not because of her grade, though she did score a 98, but because of the depth of understanding she demonstrated. Instead of simply listing causes of the French Revolution, Emma had written about how economic inequality creates social tensions that eventually explode into political change. She'd connected the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality to later democratic movements, showing how ideas evolve across time and geography. Her essay on the Industrial Revolution didn't just describe technological changes, but explored how those changes affected family structures, urban development, and social class divisions. Dr. Martinez had written on Emma's paper, "This shows exceptional analytical thinking. Have you been working with a new tutor?" When Emma mentioned that her Uber driver had helped her understand the connections between historical events, Dr. Martinez was intrigued enough to mention it to Rebecca during their next parent conference. "Emma's performance has improved dramatically this semester," Dr. Martinez told Rebecca over coffee in her office. "Not just her grades, which were already excellent, but her engagement with the material. She's asking deeper questions and making connections that suggest real intellectual curiosity, rather than just test preparation." Rebecca felt a familiar mixture of pride and confusion. She was thrilled that Emma was succeeding, but she couldn't understand what had changed. Emma's schedule was the same, her tutors were the same, and if anything, Rebecca had been traveling more frequently for work. The idea that an Uber driver might be influencing Emma's academic performance seemed impossible. Meanwhile, the connection between Marcus and Emma was deepening in ways that surprised them both. Emma began asking about Sophie, curious about what it was like to have a more relaxed childhood. Marcus shared stories about Sophie's adventures at her public school, her friendships with kids from different backgrounds, and her latest obsession with marine biology that had started when she found a tide pool book at the library. "She sounds happy," Emma said wistfully after Marcus described Sophie's excitement about a school field trip to the aquarium. "She is," Marcus agreed. "Not because her life is perfect, but because she has space to figure out what makes her happy." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember the last time someone asked me what makes me happy. They ask about my grades, my practice schedule, my college plans, but not what I actually enjoy." The question haunted Emma for days. What did make her happy? She realized she didn't know. Her life was so scheduled, so focused on achievement and improvement, that she'd never had time to explore her own interests or preferences. Even her supposed free time was filled with activities chosen for their educational value or college application potential. During one of their afternoon rides, Emma asked Marcus a question that surprised him. "Do you miss teaching?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "I miss parts of it. I miss watching students discover that they're capable of more than they thought. I miss those moments when someone suddenly understands a concept they've been struggling with. But I don't miss the parts of teaching that weren't actually about helping kids learn." "What do you mean?" test prep, grade inflation, teaching to standardized assessments. All the stuff that makes education about performance instead of understanding. The best part of teaching was when I could help students see that learning is about becoming more fully themselves, not about becoming what someone else thinks they should be. Emma felt a stab of recognition. Her entire educational experience had been about becoming what others expected rather than discovering who she actually was. The irony was that her academic success was making her feel increasingly disconnected from any authentic sense of self. "What if I don't know who I am underneath all the achievements?" Emma asked quietly. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror, seeing the vulnerability in her expression. "Then maybe it's time to find out. And maybe that's more important than any test score or grade point average." The conversation marked another shift in their relationship. Emma began sharing her fears and doubts in ways she never had with anyone else. Marcus listened without judgment, offering perspective without trying to fix everything. For the first time in years, Emma felt truly seen by an adult who cared about her well-being more than her performance. As autumn progressed into winter, their daily rides became a sanctuary for both of them. Emma looked forward to the 15 minutes each morning and afternoon, when she could be honest about her struggles without disappointing anyone. Marcus rediscovered his passion for helping young people navigate the challenges of growing up in a world that often valued achievement over authenticity. Neither of them realized how much their connection was being noticed by others, or how dramatically it would soon change both of their lives. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in November. Rebecca was reviewing quarterly projections when her assistant knocked on her office door with an unusual expression. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Westfield Prep is online too. They're asking if you can come in today for an urgent meeting about Emma." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Urgent meetings at elite private schools usually meant one of two things: disciplinary problems or academic failure. Emma had never been in serious trouble, but her anxiety had been worsening despite the medication and therapy sessions. Rebecca cleared her afternoon schedule and drove to the school with a growing sense of dread. Principal Davidson's office felt more like a corporate boardroom than a school administrator's space. Rebecca sat across from Emma's guidance counselor, Mrs. Park, and Dr. Martinez, trying to read their expressions. The meeting wasn't what she'd expected. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we wanted to discuss Emma's remarkable academic transformation this semester," Principal Davidson began. "Her teachers have reported unprecedented improvement, not just in grades, but in engagement and analytical thinking." Rebecca felt relief mixed with confusion. "That's wonderful news, but I'm not sure I understand why this requires an urgent meeting." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, pulling out a folder of Emma's recent work. "Take a look at these essays from the beginning of the semester, compared to her recent submissions. The difference is extraordinary." Rebecca examined the papers, noting the progression from competent but formulaic responses to thoughtful analysis that demonstrated genuine understanding. Emma's recent work showed creativity and insight that went far beyond test preparation. "We're curious about what's changed in Emma's support system," Mrs. Park said carefully. "Has she been working with a new tutor or educational consultant?" "Not that I'm aware of," Rebecca replied, feeling a familiar pang of guilt about how little she knew about Emma's daily routine. "She has the same tutors she's worked with all year." Emma mentioned that her Uber driver has been helping her understand difficult concepts, Dr. Martinez said. "At first, we thought she was being modest about additional tutoring, but she's quite specific about learning during her rides to and from school." Rebecca's mind raced. She'd arranged for Marcus Chen to be Emma's regular driver months ago, appreciating his reliability and punctuality. She'd never considered that he might be providing educational support. "Could you provide us with this driver's contact information?" Principal Davidson asked. "We'd like to understand his educational background and methods. Emma's improvement suggests he may have qualifications we should know about." That evening, Rebecca found herself doing something she rarely had time for: investigating someone who worked for her family. A simple internet search for Marcus Chen revealed nothing unusual, but a deeper dive through professional networking sites yielded surprising results. Marcus Chen had been a high school mathematics teacher at Jefferson High School in Aurora until 2 years ago. His LinkedIn profile, which hadn't been updated since leaving education, listed 8 years of teaching experience and a master's degree in mathematics education from the University of Colorado. Rebecca stared at her laptop screen, trying to process what she was seeing. The man she'd been paying minimum wage plus tips to drive her daughter to school was a certified educator with nearly a decade of classroom experience. She scrolled through his teaching portfolio, finding student testimonials, praising his ability to make complex concepts accessible, and his dedication to helping struggling learners find confidence. The irony was devastating. Rebecca had spent thousands of dollars on private tutors and test prep services, while inadvertently employing someone far more qualified than any of them. She'd hired Marcus through the Uber app without knowing anything about his background, treating him as anonymous service labor, while he'd been providing her daughter with exactly the kind of educational support she'd been seeking elsewhere. The following morning, Rebecca made an unprecedented decision. Instead of having her assistant handle the family's transportation arrangements, she decided to ride with Emma to school. She wanted to observe this mysterious educational relationship firsthand. Marcus arrived precisely on time, as always. Rebecca watched his interaction with Emma, noting how her daughter's entire demeanor shifted from stressed and withdrawn to genuinely engaged. Their conversation during the ride revealed a rapport that had clearly developed over months of daily interaction. "Mr. Chen," Rebecca said as they approached Westfield Prep, "would you have time to speak with me privately this afternoon?" Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror, recognizing the formal tone that suggested this wasn't a casual request. "Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez. What time would work for you?" They arranged to meet at a coffee shop near Emma's school after the afternoon pickup. Rebecca spent the day trying to concentrate on work while processing what she'd observed. Emma had been more animated during that 15-minute car ride than Rebecca had seen her in months. The anxiety that typically shadowed her daughter seemed to lift during her conversations with Marcus. The coffee shop meeting felt surreal. Rebecca, accustomed to boardroom negotiations and high-stakes business discussions, found herself sitting across from her employee, trying to understand how she'd so completely misjudged someone she interacted with regularly. "Emma's teachers tell me you've been helping her with schoolwork," Rebecca began, unsure how to navigate this unusual conversation. Marcus nodded, his expression careful. "She asks questions sometimes during our rides. I try to help when I can. I discovered that you're a certified teacher with significant classroom experience. Why didn't you mention this when we hired you?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus considered his response, recognizing that this conversation could change everything about his employment situation. "You hired me to drive Emma to school safely and on time," Marcus said simply. "That's what I've been doing. The conversations we have during those rides develop naturally. I wasn't trying to overstep any boundaries." Rebecca felt the weight of assumptions she'd made about people based on their current circumstances rather than their actual qualifications. "But you left teaching to drive for Uber. That's quite a career change." Marcus's expression shifted, revealing the pain he usually kept hidden. "My wife died 2 years ago. I have a 9-year-old daughter who needed me to have more flexible hours than teaching allows. Driving gives me the schedule flexibility to be present for Sophie while still earning income." The simple explanation shattered Rebecca's preconceptions about why qualified people might end up in jobs that seemed beneath their education level. Marcus hadn't failed as a teacher or lacked ambition. He'd made a sacrifice that prioritized his child's emotional needs over his own career advancement. "Emma's improvement has been remarkable," Rebecca said, her voice softer. "Her teachers are amazed by the depth of understanding she's showing. They asked me to find out about your methods." Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression Rebecca had seen from him during their conversation. "I don't have methods, really. I just listen to her questions and try to help her see how different subjects connect to each other and to the real world." Most of what she was struggling with wasn't about intelligence. She's incredibly smart. She just needed someone to help her understand why what she was learning mattered. Rebecca felt a stab of recognition. Emma had never lacked intelligence or work ethic. What she'd been missing was exactly what Marcus provided: patient attention from someone who valued her understanding over her performance. "Why haven't you tried to return to teaching?" Rebecca asked. "I've thought about it," Marcus admitted, "but Sophie still needs consistency, and teaching positions don't offer the flexibility of being available when she's sick or has school events. Maybe someday, when she's older." Rebecca sat in silence, processing the implications of what she'd learned. She'd been paying premium prices for educational services that were less effective than the support Emma was receiving from someone she'd viewed as unskilled labor. More importantly, she'd failed to recognize the potential in someone who worked for her family every day. "Would you be interested in a different arrangement?" Rebecca asked carefully. "Something that might use your teaching background more formally while still giving you the flexibility you need?" Marcus looked surprised. "What do you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet," Rebecca admitted. "But Emma's transformation suggests you have something valuable to offer. Maybe we can find a way to make that work for everyone involved." The conversation marked a turning point that neither of them fully understood yet. Rebecca left the coffee shop with a new perspective on the assumptions she'd made about people based on their circumstances. Marcus drove home wondering if this unexpected recognition might lead to opportunities he'd thought were lost forever. That evening, Rebecca found herself having the most honest conversation she'd had with Emma in months. Instead of asking about grades or test scores, she asked how Emma felt about school, what she enjoyed learning, and what made her feel confident rather than anxious. Emma's answers revealed how much her mother had missed while focusing on academic outcomes rather than educational experiences. The ride conversations with Marcus had reminded Emma that learning could be joyful, that questions were more valuable than answers, and that understanding was more important than performance. "He makes me feel smart," Emma said simply. "Not because I get things right, but because he helps me see that I can figure things out." Rebecca realized that this was exactly what she'd been trying to provide through expensive tutors and enrichment programs. The difference was that Marcus offered something money couldn't buy: authentic interest in Emma as a person rather than as a student to be optimized. 3 months later, the changes were impossible to ignore. Emma's panic attacks had stopped entirely, not because her schedule became easier, but because she'd learned to approach challenges with curiosity instead of fear. Her grades improved across every subject, but more importantly, she began asking questions that demonstrated genuine intellectual engagement rather than mere compliance. Rebecca created a unique position for Marcus as Technova's Director of Educational Innovation, focusing on developing learning programs for employees' children. The role offered the flexibility he needed while utilizing his teaching expertise in ways that benefited multiple families. Marcus kept his Uber driving on weekends, partly for the supplemental income, but mostly because he'd grown to appreciate the diverse perspectives his passengers provided. The most profound change was in Rebecca herself. She began leaving work earlier, not just to spend time with Emma, but to actually listen to her daughter's thoughts and interests. They started cooking dinner together on weekends, with Emma teaching Rebecca recipes she'd learned from watching cooking shows during her rare free moments. These simple activities revealed aspects of Emma's personality that had been hidden beneath layers of academic pressure. Emma's relationship with school transformed from endurance to engagement. She joined the debate team, not because it would look good on college applications, but because she discovered she loved researching complex issues and articulating her thoughts. Her violin practice became less about perfect technique and more about musical expression, leading to performances that moved audiences instead of merely impressing them. Marcus found unexpected fulfillment in his new role, developing programs that helped other children avoid the academic anxiety that had nearly overwhelmed Emma. His workshops for parents focused on supporting learning without creating pressure, helping families understand the difference between achievement and education. Sophie thrived in her new environment, becoming fast friends with Emma despite their age difference. The girls' friendship bridged the gap between their different worlds, with Sophie introducing Emma to the joy of unstructured play while Emma shared her love of science and literature. The ripple effects extended beyond their immediate families. Other Uber drivers began sharing their own hidden qualifications and unfulfilled potential. Rebecca implemented hiring practices at Technova that looked beyond current circumstances to identify talent in unexpected places. The company's culture shifted toward valuing diverse experiences and recognizing that capability doesn't always align with conventional career paths. Emma's story became a quiet legend at Westfield Prep, inspiring other students to seek authentic connections with learning rather than pursuing grades for their own sake. Her transformation demonstrated that academic success without personal fulfillment was ultimately hollow, while genuine understanding created confidence that extended far beyond any classroom. On a spring morning exactly 1 year after their first conversation about the periodic table, Marcus picked up Emma for what would be one of their last regular rides together. Emma had earned her driver's license and would soon have her own car. Their daily conversations would become occasional check-ins, but the foundation they'd built would endure. "You know what I figured out?" Emma said as they drove through the familiar Denver streets one final time. "The best teachers aren't always the ones in classrooms. Sometimes they're the people who see what you need and care enough to help, even when it's not their job." Marcus smiled, thinking about all the unexpected ways life had brought meaning to both of their journeys. And sometimes the best students are the ones brave enough to admit they don't have all the answers. Years later, Emma would credit those daily car rides with saving not just her grades but her relationship with learning itself. Marcus would return to classroom teaching when Sophie entered high school, bringing with him insights about education that could only come from seeing it through the eyes of someone who had rediscovered its true purpose. The story wasn't really about an Uber driver or a CEO's daughter. It was about recognizing human potential wherever it exists, understanding that everyone has something valuable to teach and learn, and remembering that authentic connection can transform lives in ways that money and status never could. Rebecca kept a photo on her desk of Marcus, Emma, and Sophie at Emma's high school graduation. It served as a daily reminder that the most important investments aren't always the most expensive ones, and that sometimes the help we need most comes from the places we least expect to find it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.